I suppose there's no doubt that history of 20th century geography takes it for granted that a profound transformation happened somewhere around the 60s. Today, we are very fortunate to have three individuals who played key roles in that transformation, and I'd like to hear from them what were the roots and origins of their sense that, in fact, a transformation was needed. We have Professor Torsten Hagerstrand from Lund, Professor Dick Chorley, and Professor Michael Chisholm from Cambridge. So I'd like to begin with that question, and perhaps begin with you, Torsten. You felt that some malaise with the status quo in geography. You felt some change was needed. Could you identify, characterize what was the essential thing you felt was needed?
Well, I think to begin with, it was a very personal thing. I was brought up in a university environment with a heavy emphasis on regional geography, and most of the topics for dissertations given was to study in a French manner, I suppose, a small region of the country. And I got one of these regions as my task, but I couldn't get out of it somehow. So then I began to see what was going on in other disciplines around, and that is the way I ended up the way I did. And so to begin with, it was more or less to solve a personal crisis. But the way it was solved, it was, of course, depending very much on the situation, what was available to pick up. And there are many threads, of course, going back in time up to that point. But I certainly had no idea or no intention of trying to influence geography as a field. I wanted to make a decent dissertation. That was my problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it was, in a way, an attempt to get out from under the shadow of the Gestalt-type regional geography.
Exactly, yes.
Would this be characteristic of your experience?
Well, in my case, almost the opposite, because the training that I had as a student was almost entirely systematic. There was really no regional geography involved. And I think by the time I'd finished my undergraduate studies, the problem, as I perceived it, was that the subject was trying to ask some interesting questions, but was to some extent lacking the tools with which to do this, but was still also very much concerned with rather traditional issues, like how does one define a region, what regions are, and what should geography be all about. And to some extent these seemed to be not quite trivial, but that there were more important problems that one might be interested in. It was really only after I left the department and went elsewhere that my eyes were, in any real sense, opened to the possibilities. Mm-hmm. And, well, perhaps that's something what we might come back to in a minute or two, but that's where it started for me.
Mm-hmm. So it was primarily in terms of the thematically oriented descriptive geography, and you felt it should be a question-asking field.
Yes.
And among those questions, the issue of regional boundaries seemed a little trivial.
So yes, that's right. Mm-hmm. And I think, to be fair, there were certainly a number of quite important problems within the themes that we were dealing with where one could begin to see answers, but all sorts of other areas where it really didn't seem possible.
I see. Uh-huh. Now, Dick, you come from physical geography, right?
That's right, yeah.
Yes. So how did you see the need for a change in the establishment of your geography?
Well, my experience was rather different from Michael's. I was an undergraduate in Oxford, and of course my training was almost entirely in the traditional kinds of qualitative regional geography. Like Torsten, we were all given an area, or at least we were allowed to choose an area. It didn't have to exceed 150 square miles. That presented certain problems, but we had to write about it in a very general sort of way. And indeed, much of the training, as I say, was essentially of the regional geography kind. And I suppose that the major influence at that stage, which led me to suppose that geography might consist of something else, was the sort of training that I had from my tutor at Oxford, who was Robert Beckinsale. And he introduced me to broader concepts in geography. And at that stage, I was, in a sense, dissatisfied with the sort of problems which were being raised by regional geography, in the sense that the questions seemed interesting but too broad, too general to be answered in any specific kind of way. They had to be answered in either a descriptive way or some sort of an emotive, artistic manner. And I was, at that stage, rather dissatisfied with the subject. But thereafter, I went to the United States. I spent 6 years in the United States working under Professor Strehler. And I was primarily then in Department of Geology. So in fact, that whole period really divorced me in a professional sense from geography and put me into, I suppose, what we would now call earth science. So in a way, my dissatisfaction with what I saw in the pre-existing sort of pre-1950 geography was to some extent articulated, given direction by what I was exposed to in the earth sciences.
In a sense, could I pick up on that point? Because, well, Dick went to the United States, which was 6 years away from geography. I then went for 5 years into agricultural economics, which was analogously taking me away from geography. And I found that that opened my eyes, mainly in the economic field and also to some extent in statistics, because it was a well-equipped institute in statistics. It opened my eyes to a range of techniques and ways of looking at things which provided opportunities to answer some of the questions which had been triggered, and where in my undergraduate days, if I think of Gus Caesar, Vaughan Lewis in particular as two teachers who had been very influential and to some extent had shown me the way, but I felt I could follow on from that experience. So I think many similarities in that respect.
That's right. Yes, yes.
But somehow you must have found geography enough interesting for going back to it. I guess if you had started in agricultural economics, or
Yes.
if you had started in earth sciences, you would have remained approximately in those areas. So there must have been something in your previous geography experience which took you back, so to speak.
Well, either that or a perception that it might be more difficult to make one's way as a professional agricultural economist than as a geographer. And I certainly set out to maintain my links. But I think, yes, deep down, the attachment to the subject was there.
Now that's an interesting point, because how did you at all get into geography in the first place?
For myself,
Yes.
well, really, because at school it was a teacher who had a very formative influence on me, a man by the name of Oscar Backhouse, who was a very enthusiastic man. He'd had no training in teaching at all, but he had a marvelous ability to convey the reality of the world around. And I went on 2 or 3 summer camping holidays in Wales with him and some other lads, climbing. And he opened my eyes to the physical geography of the world around in a way that was really quite dramatic. And it just then seemed the only subject I could offer to get into university, and it seemed natural to go to university, and that's how it happened.
What about your early
Well, I
attraction
don't know.
to
I was
geography?
interested in stamp collecting. I was interested in drawing maps, and I too was influenced by a very good teacher, Miss Lake. I came from a very small country grammar school in Minehead in West Somerset, and it was, interestingly enough, only about 20 miles from the grammar school that Peter Haggart went to. We came from the same corner of a rather remote county in England. But even there, I was subjected to some, what I now recognise as very good teaching in geography. So that really is, I suppose, where it all started in that sense. But although I was nominally working in geology departments in the United States, of course, at that time, much more of the first flight geomorphology in America was being done in geology departments than in geography departments. So that although I was working in a geology department, I still consider myself to be a geographer, in a sense, forced to operate in a rather alien environment, which turned out to be very interesting and
Yes.
very formative.
Yes, I think the big difference is that in Britain, geomorphology covers areas which would not be considered part of geography in America. The split
Yes,
between the physical and the human is
It's very,
yes,
very dramatic,
yes.
isn't it?
Well, it seems odd now that you are all attracted to geography. I know of your experience, though. You were all attracted by this landscape appeal, the interest in the physical
Right.
environment, something of a Gestalt impression of place and people. And yet, when you saw the need to change the discipline, you went in a direction of specialization, either on physical or human. Did you see any tension between that early interest of geography and this need for becoming specialized later?
Which are you looking at, Dick or myself?
Shoot. Yes. Well, well, I think we begin with Torsten
Torsten,
because he
yes.
has thought about it.
Mm.
You had a tremendous sense of the sense of place and area and the wholeness of everything together. You've written about it in your essay. And yet, when you got this assignment to do one of these monographs on the area that would give the whole picture, you shut off on a migration model to say to complete it. You felt it was impossible to keep the whole, so you went along systematic lines. How do you deal with that?
Yes, my father was a school teacher and one of the first ones to introduce home area studies, which I was exposed to as a very young child. And since I lived in the area, of course, I saw it, so to speak, both from the inside and outside. And this was, for me, a kind of ideal. And when I came to the university, I had expected something of that kind, but I really didn't, because the textbook I was exposed to begin with was this terrible book on Europe written by Head. You had to go through every little corner of Germany and France and every little hill, you know, and it was just an impossible amount of memorizing, and it didn't give you any hint of how to go about systematic investigations, even if you had a kind of a holistic ambition. And I didn't get any advice, so what could I do except go into a more narrow specialization where one could really ask questions. And in Sweden, the population and connections with demography was a very obvious option to start with.
As far as I'm concerned, Anne, it wasn't really starting from a holistic viewpoint, because the teacher that I had at school, when we were out in Wales, his interest was really in the physical geography and particularly in the glacial. And in a sense, we were having outdoor lessons and in terms of why are the valleys shaped the way they are and all of this kind of thing. And his interest was really a problem orientation rather than the holistic local environment. So it was a very different introduction as far as I was concerned.
Well, my experience, of course, at the university was to introduce me to a kind of Gestalt holistic view of the discipline. But I think that I recognized that the questions that were being asked were, firstly, not very clear. I wasn't very clear what the object of the exercise was, but I was clear that whatever the object was, it was probably very important. But it was equally clear that one could only approach this in two apparently different ways. You could either get, if you like, emotive feelings about man and place and try to bring in lots of qualitative interrelationships which gave you a general feeling about regions, or else you could try to take the region to pieces and to look at the way in which various interactions within the regional setting were operating. And it just, I suppose, my own inclinations in terms of physical geography, the kinds of influences that I was exposed to in the earth sciences in the United States, tended to push me into the latter direction rather than the former.
And you do still think of it as an either-or. You think that you either have the holistic or the atomistic in a way.
Well, now I believe, you see, that the great, as I see it, the kind of changes which went on in the 50s, I think that the major changes in geography did go on in the 50s. The backwash continued into the 60s, and has been in a sense superseded by different currents now. But the sort of changes which went on in the in the 50s, tended to encourage geographers to take the subject apart, to look at the pieces, and that, in a sense, that was so successful. It's gathered force that we're now in a situation where we're just surrounded by pieces, and the big problem now is how to put it together again.
Yes.
And it's becoming increasingly easy to dismember the subject, increasingly difficult to put it together and to try to reformulate, if you like, what I would consider to be important regional questions in a way which is which one can attempt to attack with some degree of sophistication.
Yes.
In a sense, I think I would share Dick's feeling in that respect, but in a slightly different way, that I think all of us need to have some concept of a whole, a gestalt, but in practice, for most everyday purposes, one has to fall a long way short of that. And I think I left university feeling rather impatient with the attempts to achieve a wholeness, which really seemed to me to be beyond the bounds of any one individual. Yet nevertheless, one needs to have that concept in mind whilst trying to tackle much more mundane, much more simple, little bits. And I think Dick is right that what people have lost sight of is that in trying to disaggregate and make things manageable and practicable, too many have lost sight of the need simultaneously, and I think one has to do it simultaneously, to have an eye on the whole and the complete. And so one is, in a sense, working, as I see it, with what one would ideally like to do up here and what one can practically do down below. I don't know whether Dick would visualise it in those terms, but that's the way I see it.
Oh yes, I think this is very much the case. I mean, in my own experience, the kinds of influences I was exposed to during my period in the United States, which covered much of the 50s, tended to reinforce this notion that one ought to be able to, take the subject apart, look at interrelationships, and then perhaps try to begin to put it together again. You see, the major influence on me in the United States was Arthur Strehler, and he had been influenced particularly by Bill Crumbine, the geologist from Northwestern, who I suppose is the first geologist really to introduce a sound statistical basis into his work in the early 30s on sedimentary petrology. So that Strehler was really providing for geomorphologists and indeed for geographers, because he's a very eminent physical geographer himself, some knowledge of statistics. I remember when I first went over to the United States and on a Fulbright in 1951. I'd just come out of Oxford, and I figured that I knew most of the things about geography. And I walked into Strehler's office, and there was this tall, very diffident, gangling man, freckle-faced man, and he was extremely quiet, very modest, and we had a short talk. And as I was leaving, he pressed a reprint into my hand, and it was a paper that he just recently had published on slope development in the Verdugo Hills, which was one of the first papers really written by a geographer to introduce simple statistical methods as we now would view them into geomorphology. And I remember going into the cafeteria at Columbia University, and I sat down and I got myself it was a chocolate malt, I remember, I had with a straw, and I opened this thing, and I couldn't understand a word of it. And I remember I'd started drinking this, and the chocolate malt stopped about halfway up the straw, and it remained there for about half an hour. Well, I tried to understand what it was about, and I've been working on that article now for about 30 years, and I can just about understand it. But that was one of the influences, and of course one's got to recognize really that when one talks about physical geography and human geography, one of the great benefits that geography as a whole, I think, got in the 50s, and I suppose also in the 60s, but less so, was that physical geography did provide at least one avenue into which, or through which, quantitative techniques, although developed in other disciplines, could be channeled into geography. And of course, when one looks at much of the quantitative work that's been done in geography, essentially it's been taking aspatial techniques, developed in allied disciplines and making them spatial. I mean, I suppose this is Brian Berry's, or at least one of his great contributions in terms of factor analysis. Much of the spatial autocorrelation stuff now is simply, in a sense, taking the aspatial time series analysis and applying it in a spatial sense. Torsten's own work is an obvious example of taking statistical techniques and applying them in a spatial sense. But certainly physical geography did provide one of the most powerful avenues through which quantitative methods tended to come into this. Of course, the other thing really which Strehler provided was the notion of systems. He was the first, I suppose, influential geographer to recognize through the work of someone like Bertalanffy that perhaps one ought to be trying to look at, if you like, correlation structures, feedback structures, trying, in a sense, after taking things apart, trying to put them together again in some sort of working manner. So I suppose his influence on geographers, particularly physical geographers, to try to look at imminent processes rather than ancient processes, to try to look at operations which are working together in terms of present processes. That was his, again, another of his big influences in the sense that he had on me.
I must say I'm fascinated by the degree of parallels because my own experience when I went to Oxford, the dominant influence there was Colin Clark, the international economist, and with him there was a strong element of intuition, and his intuitive ability allowed him to see relationships between events and data and information that lesser fry, really like myself, just could not get a hold of. And rather like Dick, with that paper from Strehler, that it's taken a long time to get to understand it. I did not understand what Colin Clark was up to, and to some extent I have some skepticism still about his intuitions, but his intuitions were backed with very considerable skills in particularly the manipulation of statistics in the human domain. And it really became very clear to me that the kind of things which I had been made a little bit aware of in physical geography, and particularly with Vaughan Lewis and glacial movement, that there was a whole avenue of an arena of techniques that would be applicable in the human field, sitting here amongst economists and statisticians that I just had never heard of as an undergraduate. And this was immensely exciting. And I became aware, I have no statistical sophistication to advance the techniques, I can't really claim to do that, but aware that they could be applied to problems in a spatial dimension. And I also became aware, Dick's just referred to systems and feedback and this kind of thinking. I was then very explicitly introduced to the same set of ideas, but in a totally different context, that of economics, where the concepts of elasticity of demand, elasticity of supply responses, and all of these behavioral responses are systems analysis with feedback mechanisms that are either self-correcting or disequilibrating, if I get the word right, depending on the set of circumstances. And so, although I didn't at that time get to hear about von Bertalanffy and the so-called systems literature, I was for 5 years exposed to a discipline which thinks in system terms.
Yes, whether or not they mean the same thing by the word system.
Right.
I'd really like to pick up a point you were beginning to develop, and that is that systems analysis was obviously appropriate in geomorphology. It was unquestionably geographic also, because it was dealing with the Earth and so on. Space was there, but space was not the crucial identifying aspect, which it had to become for all of those economic and demographic types who were pulling in models from other disciplines. And just adding the spatial word to it,
Yes.
it was the same word, systems, meant two very different things, it seems to me, after this transformation. And I think the key metaphor was the system, an organic or mechanical, but organic system, whereas the spatial one, it seems to me, was always tongue-in-cheek. Or I always felt that the word was being used, spatial systems,
Yes.
with the exception of maybe transport and so on. But there was this loose metaphorical use of the term in human geography that I think did not make it as convincing a metaphor in that area as, say, yours on geomorphological systems. See what I mean?
Well, I think you see the setup was simpler, as it always is in physical geography, compared with human geography, which I think is a much more complicated setup.
I'm glad you're
altogether. And I think also, of course, that because physical geography is simpler, the problems are, in a sense, more clear-cut than they are in human geography. But you see, what Strehler was essentially working on, and what I got not only from him, but from some of his most influential students, of whom Stanley Shum, I suppose, is the most one that springs to mind most obviously, is that a systems way of looking at things is really in its prime when you are dealing with setups which have got short relaxation times, when you can more or less forget history, when you can more or less forget sequences of change, when you can more or less forget the past. So that in a way, you see, the emphasis which tended to be put on physical geography in the 50s and 60s moved away from the old geologically based denudation chronology type of geomorphology, which was still dominant in this country, towards the study of situations in which form and process were reasonably related, where adjustments were going on rapidly enough so that you could at least try to relate form and process. And essentially, one of the difficulties which we've subsequently found in physical geography is, of course, that much of the result of that kind of change which went on in the discipline has pushed the study of physical geography into those areas in which you've got, for want of a better phrase, process response systems of short relaxation time. In other words, people are working on beaches, they're working on sand dunes, they're working on hydraulic geometry of alluvial channels. If they're working on total landscapes, they're working on landscapes which are small scale, unresistant materials, not very vegetated. In other words, a typical clay shale badlands. There was a movement away from looking at great big landscapes.
So you're saying that actually the systems methodology and the conceptual structure of system is not delivering the goods on bringing the pieces back into a whole like you felt it would promise?
Well, it tended to bring a whole lot of pieces back together, but only doing it well for certain sorts of situations. In other words, the more you get involved in historical situations, the less good systems analysis is. But on the other hand, you say, one of the great problems of new geography was the dominance of the historical approach. That was really what most people, when you really get down to it, that's really what most geographers were bucking against. In other words, if you look at the classic type of regional geography as practiced certainly in this country, and as preached by someone like Hartshorne, was very much dominated by great sweeps of history. And in other words, what you saw was not the result of what was going on now, but you saw, in other words, as you see the light from a distant star, you see it as the result of something which happened a long time ago, or a palimpsest of all sorts of things which have happened at different stages, which just happen to be hanging around at the moment. And that really was the problem. People, I think that most people who were concerned with the new geography tended to move into more imminent things, to move away, and that's away from history. And that's, of course, why historical geography has suffered such a big decline in the 50s and in the 60s. That's why denudation chronology has faded away. When I came back from the United States, I was introduced to a very eminent, the most eminent British geomorphologist, very much concerned with denudation chronology. And I was introduced to him as somebody who'd been working with Arthur Strehler, and he just looked at me. That's the first time I'd ever met him, and he said, "Next time you see Strehler, tell him I spit at him." He turned and walked away. And that was the general. That in the late 50s was part of the attitude. But now you see, there's no work on denudation chronology at all going on.
It's gone too far. But in a sense, there were, I think, some very interesting parallels there on the human side, because I think in human geography there was the desire for the precision of the natural sciences, where in physical geography we could begin to see that this was happening. And to this extent, the human geographers, I think, were chasing systems, perhaps in contexts that were somewhat inappropriate. Secondly, and I think we must remember this, it's certainly true of Britain. I'm not sure how far it was true in other countries, but immediately after the war, there was a very strong sense that that was the war to end all wars, that we were going to build and create a new and just and permanently just society, and that in the light of the Keynesian revolution immediately before the last war, it was believed that governments understood how the economy worked. It was believed in the light of a number of people in the field of planning and the reports which had emanated during the last war, that it would be possible to plan the physical use of land. And there was a very strong social and contemporary belief that man could in fact escape his history, that he was not a prisoner of things that had been happening over generations and generations, but he could in fact plan it and organize it and control it. And that was a very powerful pressure on human geography, again, to shorten the timescales and to try and simplify the problems into forms that would be manageable and that would give precise and clear answers. And certainly for myself, I think I was conscious of the search for the organizing principles, the theoretical structures that would enable one to do that. And the interesting thing, of course, was that one then went back to some extent to the historical workers. And in a sense, it was only after I graduated that I discovered people like Weber, Kristalla, von Thunen. These writers had really just not come my way as an undergraduate. But they seemed to provide a framework for a systems kind of approach, not strictly analogous to the physical systems, but you know, an analogy that was deceptive, and it was very exciting, and it was very persuasive that we could plan and organize on a rational basis. And in that sense, Kristalla perhaps was the most important figure.
Now, do you remember how you got hold of these continental ideas in the first place?
For myself, yes. It is very clear in my memory. Going to Oxford, to the Institute for Agricultural Economics, I was teaching a paper on land economics for a diploma. And the students coming on that course were coming partly from developed countries, but they were also coming from all sorts of countries like India, Sudan, Sri Lanka as we now call it, Ceylon as it then was, and really from all over the world, very different backgrounds. And the problem I had was, how on earth does one teach in 1 year something that is useful on the economics of land use, given this disparate background? One cannot really make it country and region specific, because that's going to be no use to them when they go back. Many of these people were agricultural administrators, civil servants and such like. And so, in order to provide a framework for teaching, I had deliberately to go and look for theory in order to be able to structure that teaching in a general form rather than in a specific form. And that led me to the literature in land economics, and that specifically led me to a work by Ely and Verheyen, Land Economics, and that specifically led me to von Thunen's ideas on agricultural land use via the concepts from the Chicago School of urban land use zoning. And that was really my route into the whole of that literature, and that was a key book for me.
So it was more a library experience than impulses from particular individuals.
Yes, as far as I was concerned, I had a problem to be solved, and I sought to solve it by going back through the literature. It was not so much ideas that were fed to me from teachers or at that time contemporaries or more senior people. It was I had to go out into the library searching.
I mean, I think one's got to recognise that influences come from all sorts of sources, and certainly from reading is very important. What Peter Hackett has called, to build up what Peter Hackett called the invisible college. He had a very strong feeling at the time when change was going on that there was a kind of invisible university within, intersecting all other universities, which contained people who thought similarly and were having a big influence. And certainly, as I look back on the sort of changes which went on in the 50s, I have a feeling that most of the important ideas emerged in the first half of the 50s. And I believe that the influence of people like Strehler were very important. Also Schaefer, I believe his article was extremely important, largely, of course, because he tended to articulate in a non-quantitative sort of way. I mean, the only quantitative part of Schaefer's paper is the page numbers. But essentially, he was, in a sense, articulating all the major criticisms about the preoccupation with uniqueness, the dominance of history, all these things which people were tending to react against. And I thought his work was very important. I think Torsten's is extremely important because he was certainly the first human geographer to apply quantitative techniques in a spatial sense. I think that someone like Gilbert White was, because I view him really as being the first, in terms of the new geography, the first really humane geographer, the first geographer to be concerned with problems of values. And he was a man who was concerned with the physical and the human. And also Bill Garrison. I think that his influence has often been very underrated. But his influence for me is important, not simply through the students that he had. I mean, if you just list the graduate students he had, you've got the names of almost everybody who formed, in a sense, the second wave of people, like Brian Berry. But I mean, essentially what Bill Garrison was doing, besides doing quantitative things, he was saying, well, if you look at the classic work in geography, the first chapter is on geology and the last chapter is on communications. And in a way, it ought to be turned the other way around, that the communications don't come last, they probably come first. And whereas the traditional geographers were concerned with regional differentiation, Garrison turned the whole thing on its head and said, we're concerned with what links regions. That's really what geographers should be concerned with. So I would consider that group of people working in the early 50s formed really the core of the first wave of the new geography. And what we had in the late 50s and in the 60s were really people who were carrying on the various threads of that kind of work.
That's delighted to hear that from you. I've had so many objections to a discussion we recorded on the 50s, where the case was made about Ullman and Garrison in Seattle, Schaefer and Bergman at Iowa, the underground papers flowing through northwestern Seattle and Iowa, all in the 50s. But the readers or the viewers of that say, no, that was the 60s.
Oh no, that's
No,
nonsense.
what you're saying is 50s. I'd like to pose a question to pick up on something Michael was discussing on here. There must have been some common denominator which was stronger than just methodology. One of the characterizations of the period was that, in fact, we had improved methodology. You've mentioned it several times,
Yes.
more efficient methods. Some talk of it as a conceptual revolution. But I have a sense that, in fact, there was more than that there was a vision of a better world after the war, and that science could help bring about that better
That's
world.
right.
I understand Garrison was particularly of that point of view, and Gilbert White obviously had been working in the Depression and so on, had that point of view. Do you think the value side was a common denominator which was more important than methodology in giving you a sense that you were making a transformed field now? Or do you feel that was
That's
irrelevant?
a difficult one.
While you two are thinking about an answer, let me say that I visited England in 1948, made a bicycle tour with my wife for a summer, and I was so struck by the war destruction and also by the undernourishment I saw among the population and so on, that together with reading of Mumford in the Geddes tradition, this very much influenced my work in planning in Sweden, because I believed it was right to use geography as one of the instruments to try to clear up this mess the war had created, not just in my country, of course, but still this vision of a more well-ordered world was very, very clearly in my mind.
You know, I have a little bit of difficulty in picking up on this because my own experience was one where for the period from 1954 until the end of 1959, so it's virtually 1960, I was in Oxford in agricultural economics, and the School of Geography in Oxford at that time was not in the forefront of changes, and so I didn't have immediate contact locally with geographers. And to some extent, it was really only after 1960 when I came back formally into geography in the sense of being employed, in this case at Bedford College, London, that I began to become aware and have become retrospectively aware of what other geographers were doing. And I think with that retrospective view, I would certainly endorse what Dick has said, but I didn't experience it at that time and in that way.
Well, I think that I mean, one's got to recognise that what went on in the 50s did have, I mean, obvious attractions, insofar that it appeared to be an advance from what had existed before. Certainly, the concentration in physical geography more and more on processes and forms which were related to shorter time spans tended to produce a physical geography which many people regarded as much more healthy than the kind of physical geography which was, say, in the geomorphology context, concerned with what went on in the Cretaceous. And people, in the 50s, there was a period of great euphoria in which people began to look at the subject which seemed to be emerging, and they said, well, now clearly this is something which geographers as a whole will find much more useful, much more to their taste in that sense. However, one's got to recognize that in terms of the subsequent history of geography, certainly in this country and also I suspect in the United States, this, if you like, unison of physical geography and human geography has not really borne the fruit that people at the time thought that it might do. And this, I think, was due to a number of reasons, but it's partly due to the historical roots of a great deal of Western geomorphology, but it's also due to the fact that really what was the innovative part of human geography, if you like, the new geography, was embodied in ideas about locational analysis, where space became the central thing. As Haggard said, you know, what the new geographers have done is really to rediscover the Greek notion of space as being the central core of the discipline. And one of the problems was that the questions in physical geography had not been dominantly spatial ones.
Yes.
They'd been dominantly to do with process, in which space didn't play a massive part, and they had been very dominantly temporal. So that, in a way, although there was a kind of physical geography which was developing, which because of its contracted timescales was more palatable in the geographical sense, it didn't really fall nicely into the locational analysis dominance, which was really, I suppose, the core of the new human geography in that sense.
If I come back, Anne, to the point you were making about the building of the New Jerusalem, there's one book that was, I think, really quite an interesting one in the sense of showing very clearly what geography and the old geography could not offer in this context, and it's one that certainly I felt, and I have felt ever since, was an unhappy book to have been published. It was by Freeman, Geography and Planning. Now, I don't remember the precise words, but it was a book that was published sometime in the late 50s, if I remember right. It might have been the early 60s. And somewhere, fairly early in that book, there is a phrase to the effect that the role of the geographer is to describe the situation and to discuss how it has evolved in the past, but he is not charged to try and make any projections into the future. That is something for others to do. In other words, the geographer will supply the raw material, whereas politicians and planners can then actually go and make something of it. Now that was a view of the then, or a representative of the then rather older generation, which certainly I, and I think others of the younger generation, found really was quite alien to the way we were then thinking, because we were thinking, how do you project into the future in order to be able to manipulate it?
Yes. You both felt a strong sense of that applied potential for geography, did you? Or were you did you feel geography should be a useful subject?
I personally think that there should be at least a little tip of the iceberg that is useful, but I wouldn't wish to say that the whole of the subject must be regarded as useful, because I just don't know the criterion for use. And
But
utility.
Dick, I would love to hear your view on that very much, whether the excitement about something new had more to do with the aesthetics of new model development or the actual practical utility to society.
Well, I believe that practicality in geography is like good works in religion. I think that I think that first you must have the good theory,
Have the
theology, and if you've got good theory and good theology, then good works and good practicality stem from that. I think that to put the good works first, the practicality first, is to put the cart before the horse.
Well, that is a very nice statement of your place.
And in fact, that's what historically has happened, isn't it, Dick? That the enormous excitement was with techniques and concepts and theory, and then really in sort of the later 60s and 70s, people have been worrying, now what on earth do we apply these to? And I think certainly in the human geography area, this has been very true. But in fact, the desire to be applicable, I think, has been running through nevertheless.
Yes.
But before you come to application, you need to be able to predict in a certain sense.
Yes.
And I think in this period, in the 50s, after the tremendous advancements in physics and so on, prediction, ability to predict, was the sign of being a scientist. If you couldn't that, you wouldn't. And that is sort of sorted out the historical parts of geography and make it more interested in the present and in the future. And I think there is a common denominator. After all, we had a seminar in Bristol in the 60s called Regional Forecasting. This question of prediction was very predominant in looking for suitable models and so on.
But in a sense, I would pick up there with the point, Dick, you were making much earlier on of the relaxation time, and that systems of methodology is appropriate where the relaxation times are relatively short. I think that geographers were for a time, on the human side particularly, caught up a little bit too much with the art of predicting and a little bit too little with the problems of how can you make the relaxation times shorter and thereby minimize the need to predict. And we have not really, I think, in the geographical profession, really spent very much time on the problem of how do we make our spatial human systems more flexible and more adaptable. Now, clearly, this is something where your own work is preeminently an exception to the statement I've just been making. Your own work in time and space and the way people can combine opportunities is very clearly a problem of how to make the total system that we live in a more flexible and a more adaptable one. But I think I'm struck, in part at least, by how little this fundamental idea has been picked up and translated into how does one make urban systems, urban structures, the spatial allocation of resources, industrial location patterns, specialization of regions or diversity of employment. We have not really picked up that theme of shortening the relaxation times, enhancing the adaptability of our spatial systems.
Well, for me, one of the big results of the 50s was to demonstrate to geographers, strangely enough, that space as well as time isn't scale free. In other words, that if you you can't do the same thing for small areas, you
Right.
can't ask the same questions for small areas that you do for large areas. You can't set up the same problems for short periods of time that you do for long periods of time. And this was something which geographers hadn't really appreciated. I mean, one recognized that looking back on it now, one can recognize that the classic work on regional geography was done for areas of about the size of Beauce or the Ozarks. When people tried to do it for Asia, it didn't work. You ended up with awful things in this sense. So that this, to me, is one of the most important things. But I think that there were difficulties, there were problems with what was going on in the 50s, and these problems began to emerge in the later part of the 60s, in the sense that the real keystone, I suppose, of the work in New Geography was this idea of form, spatial form or morphological form or what have you, somehow or another being a response to the application of reasonably imminent processes.
Yes.
And I think that, with someone like Strehler, he would take you up onto a watershed and you'd look down and you'd be impressed by the unity of the drainage basin. Different sorts of processes were operating and appeared to be interdigitating the whole thing, appeared to be not only a geometrical unit but also a process unit as well. But I think one of the problems which has beset geography more recently has been that when one looks back on this kind of work, one recognizes that most of the processes which are actually being invoked, certainly in geomorphology, and I suspect also in human geography, were not really processes at all, but surrogates for process. In other words, that one was using things like bankful discharge instead of shear stress. One was using angle of stream slope against some sort of energetics of streams. I suppose, for a layman, the supreme example of this is, of course, the use of distance as a surrogate for process. And I suppose, in a way, that much of the explosion that we've had of interest in studies of process, not only in geomorphology, but in human and social geography since then, has come from the fact that people have looked at these processes and the kind of forms that they were alleged to explain, and become very dissatisfied with those processes. And what has happened, in my view, since then, has been that people have been more and more concerned with looking at more and more detailed processes, looking at social processes as distinct from, say, the more simple application of Keynesian economic processes across space. And that's really what's caused the subject to explode. And that's really what has really caused the pieces that we're looking around at now and trying to pick up and put together again.
Perhaps that would be a very appropriate theme for our second half of this discussion. I've been given the signal. This has been enormously enlightening for me. Thank you very much, all of you. And we'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you. In this second half of our discussion on the transformation of mid-century geography, we hope to broach some general issues, geography and society, geography and teaching, part and whole, and so forth. But I'd like first to bring our first discussion to somewhat of a closure by saying to you that I feel each of you has some strong convictions about what geography ought to be. Strong convictions which I didn't ask you to express in the last hour, but perhaps now if you do, then we can lead into the more general kind of questions. Shall I begin with you, Dick, because I feel you were on your way to letting me know what you thought in the last
Well, I think one can only judge what a subject ought to be in terms of what it is trying to do. And I think that it is important to identify objectives. And for me, although there may seem between the interwar period and the 1970s a great gulf, a great change in the sort of geography which practitioners have been interested in, right from the regional geography in the interwar period to an ever-increasing detailed studies of more and more concern with process over short periods of time in comparatively small areas in the early part of the 1970s at any rate. Seems to me that despite those great differences, that there were certain underlying principles on which most geographers would reasonably agree. and that is that geography is, in some senses, concerned with trying to understand why things are disposed spatially in the way in which they are, and what processes bring about and sustain and transform those sorts of distributions, whether you're thinking in a physical or in a human sense. And secondly, that one is also concerned with the way in which man in society is interacting with the environment in the broadest sense, either natural, if there ever are any natural environments anymore, or increasingly man-made. So that despite the fact that the geographers themselves would be regarded as very different sorts of animals between the 1930s and the 1970s, I believe that there was a general feeling that the objectives of geography were of that kind. I'm not at all sure that the objectives of many geographers now are of that sort. I think that this comes very largely from what you were saying earlier on about an increased interest in the practicalities of the discipline. And what concerns me really is that now an increasing number of geographers, particularly social geographers and to some extent economic geographers, are viewing the discipline not as an end in itself, but as a means to what they would regard as a higher end. In other words, that geography is itself a factor in terms of bringing about changes in the real world, which various practitioners consider to be significant and important. And I think that one of the greatest problems that geography faces at the moment is that, in a sense, the whole object of the game is, in some respects at any rate, tending to change. And that if we don't recognize that is a possibility, then it becomes very difficult to interpret the sort of situation that we find ourselves in and the sort of problems which we face. And I think that for me, this is one of the big present issues.
Problems. You would have us get back and do the ivory tower
no,
job.
I think that I believe in calling a spade a spade. I mean, if we're going to use geography, manipulate geography to bring about the sort of world that we want to bring about, okay, fair enough, let's say so. I mean, let's not kid ourselves if we're trying to objectively look at the operation of processes and the sort of forms which result from them.
Very good.
That's my view.
That's very clearly stated. Thank you. Michael?
I think I would take a rather different view from the view that Dick takes. I think I believe really very passionately that no subject can open the whole range of human experience for any one of us as an individual, that any subject is going to be dealing in practical terms with a very small part of human experience. I think secondly that any academic discipline is to a substantial extent a creature of its time. I don't think we can escape that external environment, and I think that the external environment has been placing rather greater expectations on academia as a whole to be, in one way or another, and I don't like the word, but in one way or another to be seen to be relevant to some kind of problems or issues in current society in one way or another. So I think we cannot escape that. And I think, again, thirdly, I believe very strongly that there is no independently, objectively existing subject geography. The kinds of issues that we discuss in geography could, I think, be discussed under the label well, you could invent a totally different label, or it could come under, if you're in America, the physical geography is a lot of it under the label geology. Quite a lot of the things that interest me could be done under the label economics. I do not, therefore, conceive of geography as an objectively existing subject independently from other objectively existing subjects. And in this sense, I rather visualize a discipline on the analogy of Sparta as distinct from the analogy of Athens. The point about Athens being that you have a walled city which defines a very precise area. The point about Sparta was that it had no walls and it relied upon its army. And the army went out and it conquered greater or smaller territory. And it seems to me that we ought to, as a subject, be visualizing ourselves not as an Athens where we try to build the wall around us and keep other people out, but that we are Sparta and that our army is not going out to attack in the strict analogy, but is going out looking for interesting and important things to do. And that's the way that I visualize any worthwhile subject. I don't think that it would be right to say that the whole of geography must be seen to have an immediate relevance to immediate problems. That would be ridiculous. But I do believe that we must, now and for the future, have a sufficient element of the subject which is concerned with the here and now, practical problems that humanity is faced with, that governments are faced with, that the taxpayer is wanting a little bit of a return for his money from. And I wouldn't want to say that that's what we must be doing exclusively, but I do think we've got to be looking for practical and real problems that are manifest in a spatial domain, and where the spatial domain is itself an integral and important part of the problem and the solution.
Very good. Torsten?
Well, I have never
comment.
been able to get away from my childhood dream of some coherent perspective or understanding of particularly human in his biological and technical and social and intellectual environment. And I tend to believe that if a subject which is trying to do this disappeared from the intellectual scene, sooner or later there would be felt a vacuum and some other people would come in, perhaps under a different label, but they would be trying to do exactly the same we have been trying to do. Maybe not very successful, but still there is sort of demand for, let's call it an integrative view of things. But I believe that maybe my view on this differs a little bit from yours just because of linguistic and conceptual reasons. I don't know if you noticed the little article by Peter Gould on space and room in Geographic Annal.
No, I didn't.
Yes.
Now, it was recently where he admits that space in English is more a concept for it's a dimensional concept where you locate things or events, whereas for me, as more continental in my thinking, space is first of all room. Mm-hmm. And this means that there is a problem of how the roominess of the world is handled, you see. And here is a key problem for geography, which we had never really tackled, partly because it's a bit remote from the English language, but it's very, very, very close to the German kind of thing. You know, Ratzel told about, he talked about the Earth as filled up of phenomena.
Yes.
They were not located, but they filled up the space, room. And this filling up has its own problematic, because it means that very different things come together and compete for existence. And here is really, I think, and so far untackled intellectual question to try to deal with. So that's my view on the whole issue of geography. I think there is an intellectual need for discipline or for work in an area where one is dealing with how things of different nature behave when they come together.
I wouldn't disagree with you at all, Torsten, because if I think in terms of problems and the solution thereof, many of these problems arise very precisely from the interaction of human and physical phenomena, whether this is concerned with hydrological problems or ecological or other. There are very real problems which need to be, I think, thought of and handled with some concept of the relevant whole.
Exactly.
And it would be
Yes.
the relevant whole that I would stress,
Yes.
because it cannot be the grander whole,
No.
which is going to be beyond us.
Yeah. But a consequence of this thinking is that we need another physical, or a third kind of geography, and that's geography dealing with technology. We have nature, we have the human society, but we really have never looked into how the artifacts come into the picture and what they mean.
Yes.
And
Well,
the sociologists forget about them, economists just take technology for given more or less, and the technologists, they have very little idea about both natural environment and society. So here is a need also, in order to get the picture more full, to have something developed here. But let me also say that concerning the old-fashioned regional geography, I think the mistake was that people tried to write it. One should never try to write regional geography. One should know it. It's a question of personal knowledge, which you actually can, I think, build up, but which is extremely hard to put in print. But it's still a valuable kind of knowledge.
It is. Yes, I would not deny that.
With other kinds of media. To
For
articulate.
example, other
Yes,
kinds of
yes.
media.
Yes.
I mean, to take up the point that you made about technology, for me, this is important, but its role would seem to me to reside in the links which it provides between the attempts that we make to articulate the physical and ecological systems on the one hand and the socio-economic systems on the other. That's really, for me, where technology comes in. My view of the discipline is a bit different from Michael's, in the sense that I think that if geography cannot provide some sort of unique academic service, then it's difficult to see how you can justify it. I mean, geography isn't just what geographers happen to do in a building that's called a Department of Geography. I believe that one's got to look to some core of the subject. And when one looks for the core, then I don't think there's any great problem about that. One of the difficulties with the so-called new geography was that the core appeared to be based upon some sort of, if you like, general geometrical, locational kind of language. So that locational analysis appeared to be the kind of core of the discipline. It's now, of course, become patently obvious that you cannot securely found a discipline on a body of techniques, and that if geographers are simply people who look at economics and sociology and geomorphology in a spatial context, well, what happens when the sociologists and economists, what have you, begin to learn about spatial autocorrelation? It means that geographers are out of business. For me, if there is a core to the discipline, I mean, it may not be. It may just be a hodgepodge. But if there is a core to the discipline, it has to do with the interaction of man in society and the environment in which he finds himself, or which he's made for himself. And I think one of the problems which faces geography at the moment is how one can redefine the environment in terms which enable one to make those sort of links. You see, for me, for example, space is a physical resource. Torsten was
That's for
talking
me.
about this.
And
it seems to me that space is just as much a physical thing to do with physical geography as other things which we naturally think of. And for example, I think, you see, if you look forward to the year 2000, if look forward isn't the wrong word, you're going to find that about 40% of the people in the world are going to live in cities of over 100,000. Well, now, if geography has to do with a man-environment sort of setup, then about 40% of your physical geography ought to be concerned with the physical geography of cities, and cities have got a physical geography. Of course.
But I don't think there's really any disagreement between you and I, Dick, on this, because the way I visualise the core, your emphasis on the relationship of the human actor and the physical environment, I would describe as a subset of what I would think of as a much more general idea of the core of the subject, of problems that occur in space and for which space is itself an integral part of the problem. And many of those problems are very precisely the kind that you are describing, but I wouldn't describe them as being exclusively in that interface of the physical and human. I think there are some problems in physical geography where, in a sense, you can almost totally forget the human actor. And I think there are some problems in the human geography where you can more or less totally forget the physical environment. So I think my concept, whilst I think it provides a decent core, would include yours.
I mean, I differ from your approach in the sense that you begin with the problems. For me,
Right.
you see, if you begin with the systems and what the systems are like and how they work, then the problems emerge. You can understand more why problems occur. I mean, to take perhaps the biggest problem of all, if you look at socio-economic systems, although they are, I suppose, in the long term, dominantly a set of nested negative feedback loops, or subsystems, you do have situations at particular spaces at particular times where you have positive feedback operating and becoming dominant over short periods of time. Well, now, when you have a system like that interacting with intensely conservative negative feedback, not just dominated, but totally composed pretty well of negative feedback systems or subsystems of an ecological or a sedimentary kind, then most of the problems having to do with the exploitation of the environment really stem from the fundamental differences in system structure of the two sorts of systems that one's dealing with. In other words, the problems of environmental influence and attitudes are really coming out of the manner in which we're viewing the theoretical structure of these systems. And I would always begin. For me, theory is what is the core. The practicality is what stems from it.
And one can't arrive at that without going through the systems route.
Well, no, perhaps not necessarily, but you know, we all have our own church.
Yes.
We go to.
Yes.
And again, at one level, I don't disagree with you, Dick, because I think that one has to have a dialogue between what one might describe as the theory, the systems approach on the one hand, and the practical problems on the other. I think I would just personally take my starting point from the problems and then seek to understand what are the appropriate systems with which to handle them. Your approach, I think, would be more in terms of understanding systems and then thereby recognizing problems. We, in a sense, would be converging on the same kind of terrain, but from rather different
Yes.
starting points.
You'd be coming uphill and I'd be going downhill.
Might be easier for you than for me then.
There
We won't meet halfway in that case.
there must be some underlying conceptions which are identical, more or less,
Yes.
because the way you are going to handle your problems are very much colored by the fact that you are a geographer.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Now, we are sitting here now and sort of, after all, thinking back on a situation when it was at least easier to keep the field together, even if it wasn't made satisfactory from our point of view. But don't you see a problem now with the new students who have come to geography in the 60s and 70s and never had really absorbed this ideal which we met? Is there, I think you indicated before that there is not the same strong feeling of among the younger ones to try to keep the discipline together, as maybe we feel, since we have come from a situation when it after all was kept together. How do you see the present attitudes, and what do you believe one should try to do about it in teaching?
I think I would start very explicitly by thinking of one's own trajectory over one's own life, and I think that views change as people become older, and I myself would feel that many of the younger ones who perhaps at the moment are feeling the desire to be highly specialized will come to find the need for wider horizons as they get older. And I think they might well be coming to some of the same positions, but perhaps rather later in life.
So
as a proposition.
So you don't feel really it is a problem for how you organize teaching. It will more or less come as a natural.
I myself do not perceive this as a problem, but that perhaps is because of the essentially pragmatic view that I tend to take of life and the world, and that I'm going to let metaphysical problems be looked after outside my office hours by other people, by myself in my role other than as a professional.
But you see, why I'm asking this question is that
I knew that would get you.
physical and human geography are now pursued in two different departments. You know, we are physically separate, and people don't even interact in daily life. So this is bound to have consequences. Whereas in your case here, you still have everybody exposed to the other side to a certain extent. Or isn't that true?
Oh, that is true in virtually every department in the country, with minor exceptions, yes.
Yes, I mean, it is an illusion to some extent. In other words, that much of the physical geography which goes on, I mean, far less now than in the past, but much of it could equally well go on in isolation from the rest of the discipline. And I believe that geography is moving towards, if it hasn't already reached it, moving towards a very considerable crisis in terms of fragmentation within fields, and particularly in terms of a great schism which is developing between physical and human geography. And I think that the students who come into geography at the moment are, they're partly grabbed by in a sense, the proliferation of ideas and attitudes and approaches and which they're subjected to, on the one hand, but on the other, they find it increasingly difficult to see what they are in fact doing, how if at all it fits together. And my feeling is that increasingly larger and larger numbers of students don't feel that it fits together at all. In fact, much of what passes for geography is simply a matter of administrative convenience.
Yes.
And I believe that that we cannot, I mean, that if geography is going to provide some sort of a unique intellectual experience, then it's not going to be related entirely to spatial technology, that it's got to be a society environment sort of study, and that if that's the case, then you've got physical geography has got to be changed in particular sorts of ways. And one of the great problems, of course, is that physical geography is called upon to do a lot of things, many of which are just due to historical hangovers. In other words, in this country, pretty well all the geomorphology is being done by geographers. Even that which goes right back into the past, even that which deals with climatic change over tens of thousands of years. I don't mind them doing it, but I don't think that one ought to be overly concerned with the fact that they're doing geography. I don't think they are doing geography. I think that if we're going to define physical geography, it's got to be defined in a much more rigorous way than just saying it's learning about the Earth. It's learning about the Earth at particular scales of space and time, and in particular sorts of relationships which have got relevance to man in society. And that's, for me, why systems analysis is so interesting, because it does throw the emphasis on more imminent situations. It throws the emphasis on the ways in which different parts of a given physical or ecological system interact. And it also throws up these problems of what happens when you try to interface broadly maybe different systems, like the socio-economic on the one hand and the ecological and the physical on the other. And it seems to me that if there is going to be any kind of renaissance in terms of the general holistic view of the subject, it's going to come from attitudes of that kind. And it's really going to depend now, not working on the linkages between human and physical geography, but largely on working on the content of physical geography. And I think physical geography has got to be defined in a much more restrictive way than it has been in the past.
I very much agree. So what you're speaking about is, in a sense, two kinds of physical geography: one physical geography and one human or environmental.
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't call the first one physical geography at all. I would call it climatology, geomorphology, or what have you.
But this would create a problem for your systems thinking, because then one would have to include soil science and the whole biosphere, which is a more slowly developing the area and where this fast process of thinking is not quite applicable.
Well, this, of course, is a fundamental problem. You see, if you're going to study the kind of physical human geography that I'm thinking about, it does not simply involve taking odd bits of physical geography and which appear to be relevant and just feeding them into human geography. You've got to look at whole physical systems. You can't deal with a little bit of a hydraulic system of a river, or a little bit of a beach system, or a little bit of a general soil erosion system. To understand any part of it, you've got to understand the lot. So if you understand the lot, then this automatically imposes a tremendous weight on the person who not only is trying to understand the physical part, not only is trying to understand some certain relevant aspects of human geography, but also trying to put them together. And this, of course, is the, I suppose, the catch-22 situation that geographers find themselves in.
Are you saying, Dick, can I just take you on your own ground, are you implying that the greatest changes have got to occur in physical geography?
Well, I think that the greatest changes have got to occur in physical geography and also in those aspects of human geography which deal with, if you like, individual values and attitudes. I think we've somehow or another got to tailor both of these areas into forms which are not as totally incompatible as they seem to be at the moment. And I think that if you can't do that, well, then geography is in for a period of quite considerable problems.
I think you bear a much more heavy responsibility in a way, or your position is one that is a much heavier burden than yours. Yours is much safer in a way, if you take a problem definition.
Yes.
Much safer. But in yours, it seems to me that maybe there's something of your very traditional background which gives you the sense of problem about a core, that there should be a core. Yes? And so I come back to the question of whether systems is the savior in maintaining a core, whether one can have both, the elegance of systematic reasoning and seeing things in terms of their functional relationships, and still saying we have a core shared by human and physical geographers. Are you on an impossible dream?
Well,
I think he is.
Well, I don't think so myself. It is, of course, very difficult to say. If there is a, I mean, I've put the position as I see it. I mean, I think that if geography is to have some sort of a core, then it's got to be of the kind that I've mentioned. That it cannot be totally a technological one. If it doesn't have a core, and we just happen to be people who are interested in the same sorts of things, working away in the same sorts of environments, well, fair enough. I mean, but if that's the case, then for me it's a less attractive thing, because for me always theory is the important thing. Rather, the practice stems from the theory. And if you don't have unified theory, if you don't have ways in which people can communicate with one another in a discipline in ways in which each can understand, then I think then are the problems.
I think in many ways we do differ in our starting point and our fundamental attitudes, and that's one of the differences which I don't think we would ever resolve.
Yes, I think that there are root differences also in the conceptions of what makes worthwhile knowledge,
Yes.
and what are the claims to truth and so forth, without getting into the general philosophy behind it. I think there are elements of the old organicist version of Raum in your childhood dream, which keep coming back, even if you would dismiss the political and other ideological aspects of that worldview, they're still there very much. I think in yours, Dick, there is a real sense of having a whole picture of the world. It will not be an organismic picture, but it will be a systematic one, and I think it comes closer to something about unraveling mechanisms and establishing, so the whole picture is still very important for you.
When we get up to that
Yes.
great process response system up in the sky, then all will be revealed.
Yes, yes, yes,
I'm
we've
just
heard
looking
it.
forward to that.
Yes, on that great.
Don't need to say, I told you so.
Come and get it. And I think you are not concerned about having a whole picture. You don't. You're not concerned in the same way as the two others. You would like to do a reasonable a whole picture on a problem. But it isn't a unified world with a net wrapped around it and a single sort of unifying principle. You have several problems, and each problem demands its own kind of thing. It is a respectable and valid approach to knowledge, a contextual one, and but it doesn't suffer the same burden that I think causes great anxiety to those who wish to have a unified.
I get very little sleep.
I don't always sleep soundly.
Yes, okay.
But yes, I think the whole, for me, has to be defined by the context. I don't think it has an objective external existence.
Yes. So I think it has been enormously instructive for me to listen to this. You see, I think we have a half minute, so I'll have to tell you that I come from British education in Ireland up to the time when I started graduate school at the University of Washington, in the place where Garrison and Berry and so on started their revolution. So I've always been curious about you two. You know, I hadn't read as much of yours as I had of yours, and I was curious how much of similar experiences had come into your worldview now. I want to thank you all so very much for your insights and impressions.